Hello, everyone. Welcome to this much-needed security conference, which is building and promoting the information security community in the Western Balkans region. This session is about privacy and risk-based authentication. And ironically, I will start by presenting some data, personal data with you. So as you heard, my name is Gresa, and I'm an experienced data protection specialist at ProCredit Bank Kosovo. I have a background in cybersecurity. I'm a graduate from computer engineering, and currently I'm pursuing my master's studies in the International University of Applied Sciences. Before this hands-on experience on implementing GDPR in the banking sector, I used to work with some of the most famous ISO standards in information security, cybersecurity, and risk management. One of the most frequent questions I get asked is, why data protection? Shouldn't you have a legal background to exercise that? And I assume many of you were thinking the same. Well, data security and data privacy are the two basic elements of a cybersecurity. As nearly every organization today that exists relies on data, the loss of data or misuse of one can cause tremendous consequences for an organization. However, impairing security does not only affect the organization itself, because it can cause unimpairable damages to individuals to whom the data belongs as well. That is why protection of personal data in particular has become more and more important. We, as data protection specialists, cooperate closely with software development teams and information security teams for two reasons: to protect and secure the data, but also to comply with the principles of privacy by design and privacy by default. This principle requires every organization to consider data protection and privacy at every step and every project and activity that processes personal data. Nearly all key processes and activities that we use in an organization today process personal data, and that is why having an understanding of IT security, IT management, and IT configuration is a basic skill to succeed in a data protection role. This session today comprises three main pillars. I will introduce the risk-based authentication and how it works, to continue with the privacy and risk-based authentication, and to conclude with key privacy threats and mitigations. Create strong passwords. This is a very common advice from many security specialists. Even Microsoft itself states that one of the most important ways to ensure that your online accounts are safe and secure is to protect your passwords. But is it? Because a study shows that on average a user has 16 online identities. What this means is that we as users tend to choose simple and easy to guess passwords, but also tend to reuse the same passwords across services. That is why in practice, passwords have many security flaws. One of them is that users are prone to disclosing passwords to attacks such as phishing, but we also reuse the same passwords across services. What this means is that a compromise of accounts on one service leads to a compromise of accounts on many other services. And last but not least, today, modern password cracking tools exist, and the latest studies show that a password cracking tool can find up to 2.7 billion passwords. According to a research released by SkyCloud, researchers discovered that 700 million. So we are talking about 700 million exposed credentials only in the last year. And to make the matters worse, 72% of users, guess what, still use the same passwords. So no surprise that major online services are doing something on this. One of the most proposed measures is two-factor authentication. In a two-factor authentication, a user confirms possession of another credential linked to the account, typically by a hardware token, an authentication app, a mobile phone, or an email address. However, as two-factor authentication is an opt-in process, so it requires user intervention, the user acceptance is very low. For instance, Google. Google has offered two-factor authentication since 2011. However, only 10% of users, so 10% of users were actively using it in 2018. What can be done to protect against two-factor authentication to make it more usable? Implicit authentication is one of the answers. So, if we classify the logging data as suspicious or normal attempts, then we can differentiate these attempts by other parameters and define whether it is suspicious. Implicit authentication is practical because it is employed in the background without user intervention, and it is secure as it is a continuous process. Risk-based authentication that I will elaborate more during today is an implicit authentication form. RBA, or risk-based authentication, is recommended by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the National Cybersecurity Center of United States to protect users against password spraying and credential scripting. RBA has an increased password authentication security because it leaves the usability intact. Commercial sales of RBA solutions are currently increasing and expect to do so, supporting the demand of strong authentication methods. However, currently the use of RBA is limited to a number of major service providers like Amazon, Facebook, Google, and LinkedIn. But how does RBA work? RBA monitors contextual features that can range from network features such as an IP address to client behavioral information such as login time. And based on these parameters, it calculates a risk score. So when we as users submit our login form, the risk-based authentication calculates the risk score, which is typically classified into three main categories: low, medium, and high. If the user behavior is as always, then the access is granted and the user is not bothered by another form of authentication. Whereas if the risk score is medium or high, then depending on the RBA implementation, the system requires more information as a proof. If no proof is given, then access is denied. So far, so good. RBA is offering high security, is leaving the usability intact. So why we should consider privacy? Well, don't forget that RBA offers security and usability, but all at the cost of processing our data. A data that may have a potential reference to our personal data. And in case an RBA database is forwarded or breached, then we are at a higher risk than usual, because not only the traditional username is exploited. In addition, security is not enough to meet privacy regulations. And we all agree that security and privacy have in common and focus on protection of data. However, there is a difference. Security protects confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And privacy, on the other hand, is more granular on privacy rights with respect to personal data. And privacy will always prevail when there is personal data processing, whereas security will continue to focus on the protection of information assets. Considering this, I will elaborate why the integration of RBA systems should consider data protection laws and regulations. But what is personal data? Personal data is a term used in GDPR, the famous General Data Protection Regulation. Other terms used instead of personal data are personal information and PII, the personally identifiable information as used in ISO standards. The definitions, however, are very similar. So personal data is any information relating to an identifiable natural person, which can be directly or indirectly identified. I know, very theoretical. So let's focus on the key information and map them to the RBA context. Data used by RBA certainly falls within the personal data definition. Two main reasons. The RBA works by the implementation of RBA works relying on feature values. These feature values are unique identifiers by themselves. For instance, IP address. On the other hand, the risk score. The risk score is classified as a unique identifier itself because indirectly identifies us and our interaction with the system. Introduction of data privacy regulations and laws has dramatically changed the way the online services are processing and collecting our personal data. For instance, the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act. From formally loosey recommendations on how to handle data, we now have clear and binding data protection principles. These principles of processing personal data are namely the lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, the purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, and confidentiality. In the following slides, I will outline the requirements of each principle and how the RBA system should implement them. To process personal data, we must have a lawful basis for processing, but we also should be fair and transparent with the user. What this means in the RBA context is that the design of RBA should be with consent in mind. Why? To provide users with clear and easy to understand explanations. The second principle is purpose limitation. Personal data shall be collected for specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and no further processing is incompatible with the first purpose is allowed. What this means in the RBA context is that the feature values can only be used to calculate the risk score itself. So the next principle is data minimization. What this principle states is that personal data shall be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes of processing personal data. In the RBA context, this means that feature values should be reviewed for suitability and redundant data should be deleted. However, in practice, it's not this simple, because providers of RBA systems should consider that data minimization can impact the risk score reliability. Another principle, which is straightforward, is accuracy. Accuracy means that personal data should be accurate and up-to-date. However, in the RBA context, this is crucial. Why? If we have an incorrect feature value, then the risk score is or medium or high. What this means is that the user is prompted with another factor to be authenticated, and what we are doing, we are converting the RBA to a second factor authentication. If you remember from the slides before, I stated that second factor authentication has a very low acceptance, user acceptance. So we do not want to end there. Okay. Storage limitation. Storage limitation?
I think it's too far away.
Is it good? Storage limitation. This principle states that personal data shall be kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects only for what is necessary and how long is necessary for the purpose of processing. What this means in the RBA context is that if data are no user used or no longer used, then they should be securely destroyed or anonymized. For the time being, it's important to know that anonymized data is no personal data, because I will cover anonymization in the following slides. That is why, as a provider of RBA, if we anonymize data, we can continue to use this data for testing purposes. The last principle is integrity and confidentiality. Personal data shall be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security and protects against unauthorized access, damage, or destruction. Some of the proposed measures are pseudonymization, masking, and encryption. I talked about two terms. Maybe it's the first time that you heard. Maybe you use them in your everyday life at work. Pseudonymization and anonymization reached their fame when GDPR was introduced. People not knowing security and data protection tend to use them interchangeably. Please don't do that. There is a big difference. Pseudonymization is the process of replacing personal identifiers with a pseudonym. If you can see from the picture, we are replacing the name with a bunch of numbers. But for the time being, we cannot re-identify the individuals if we don't have the key. That is why pseudonymized data falls within the scope of personal data. However, fewer processing restrictions apply. Anonymization, on the other hand, is the process of removing elements from personal data, so the process is irreversibly. This does not, as such, anonymous data is excluded from the scope of personal data and is not subject to privacy and GDPR laws. Coming to the last part, I will present the privacy threats and mitigations. Two common threats that we see related to the RBA context are data misuse and data breach. A misuse of RBA feature values is when we use the feature values for other purposes rather than calculating the risk score, typically for user tracking, profiling, or advertising. No wonder it is a threat, because we have seen happen before, where phone numbers stored for second-factor authentication were used for tracking and advertising to users. We as users should trust our online service providers to not misuse our data. However, a responsible service provider should take precautions to minimize the misuse of scenarios or unintended processing. Data breach, on the other hand, is when an unauthorized person processes personal data or has access to this data. A data breach is an attack on confidentiality. As such, it allows attackers to use the feature values to link profiles at different online services. Even if we use other credentials, they can find who we are. Depending on the service, this could result in negative social or legal consequences for the individuals and enable account takeover attack on a larger scale. But how can we mitigate them? Two methods: aggregation and logging history minimization. We can aggregate the feature values in the logging history so we can only reveal how often a feature value occurs instead of its chronological order. By aggregation, we mitigate the re-identification in logging sequences. On the other hand, by limiting the logging history in terms of the number of features and entries, we mitigate tracking users for an extended period of time. This has already been proved because the study shows that few entries are sufficient to achieve a high RBA protection. This was privacy and risk-based authentication. What I talked about was that risk-based authentication is an implicit authentication form which offers high security and usability. But please don't forget, at the cost of processing our personal data. That is why design of RBA systems must balance security and privacy. I want to conclude by quoting Steve Jobs. He once stated that privacy means people know what they're signing up for. So, fairness. In plain language and repeatedly, we should update the privacy notice. I believe people are smart, but some people want to share more than other people do. We just have to ask them. So, obtain their consent. However, I encourage you to think whether this quote really stands or not. Thank you.